Every empire that outlives its logic must eventually rest on a single claim, that it alone possesses a truth worth more than freedom. The Papal States, by the middle of the 19th century, had been making this argument for a very long time. Stretching across central Italy from Rome to Bologna, governing some 3 million souls under a system of law that most of Europe had already discarded, the last theocracy in the West survived not because it functioned well, but because no one had yet found the right moment and the right provocation to end it. The sovereign was Pius IX, elected in 1846 to wide liberal hope, and now, 12 years later, regarded by nearly every government on the continent as a reactionary embarrassment. He had begun his reign by freeing political prisoners and permitting gas streetlights in Rome. He would end it by losing everything. What changed him was 1848, the year revolution swept Europe and arrived with particular fury at his own door. A Roman mob murdered his prime minister. Pius fled the city disguised as an ordinary priest, sheltered in Gaeta, and returned only when French bayonets restored him by force. He came back a different man. The liberalism drained out of him entirely, replaced by a siege mentality that would harden, year by year, into something close to theological stubbornness. History is full of men who, upon discovering that the world will not love them as they wish, resolve to make the world irrelevant. Pius became one of them. He grew convinced that modernity itself was a conspiracy against the Church, and that any concession, political, territorial, doctrinal, would unravel the whole fabric of Catholic authority. He would later formalize this conviction in the Syllabus of Errors, a document that condemned, among other things, the proposition that the Pope should reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. And yet the kingdom he governed could not survive without the tolerance of precisely those forces. French garrisons stood between the Papal States and annexation by Piedmont Sardinia, whose prime minister, Camillo di Cavour, was assembling, with patience, cunning, and very few scruples, the coalition that would forge a unified Italy. The arithmetic was not complicated. If France withdrew its protection, the Papal States would fall, and France would withdraw the moment the political cost of defending the Pope exceeded the political cost of abandoning him. Power held on such terms is not power at all. It is a loan, callable at any time. This was the state of things in the summer of 1858, a kingdom sustained by borrowed soldiers, ruled by a man who understood compromise as apostasy, surrounded by liberal nationalism on every border. Within Bologna's old ghetto walls, Jewish families lived under restrictions that dated to the Counter-Reformation: special taxes, curfews, prohibitions on property. They were permitted, as they had been for centuries, to employ Christian servants. It was a small concession, barely noticed. It would prove to be enough. The Mortara family lived on the Via Lame in a modest apartment not far from the ghetto's edge. Momolo Mortara was a merchant, not wealthy, not poor, a man of standing within the Jewish community, but invisible to the city's Catholic authorities. He and his wife Mariana had 8 children. The household employed, as many Jewish families in Bologna did, a Catholic servant girl to perform domestic tasks forbidden to Jews on the Sabbath: lighting fires, carrying objects, the small mechanical labors that religious observance rendered unavailable 1 day in 7. Her name was Anna Maurici. She was 14 years old when she entered the Mortara home, illiterate, from the countryside near Persiceto, and possessed of the intense, unexamined piety common to young women of her class and era. She knew almost nothing of the world beyond her village and her catechism. She knew the catechism very well. In 1852, the youngest Mortara child, Edgardo, barely a year old, fell gravely ill. The infant's fever climbed, his breathing grew shallow. The family feared he would die. Anna Maurici, watching the baby struggle, became terrified, not of his death exactly, but of what she believed his death would mean. Catholic teaching held, with the weight of centuries behind it, that an unbaptized soul could not enter heaven. The doctrine was not marginal or debated. It was central, vivid, and presented to the faithful in terms designed to frighten. To Anna, the baby before her was not merely sick. He was in danger of something infinitely worse than dying. She consulted a neighbor. Some accounts say another servant, others a local grocer with a reputation for religious knowledge, and was told that in extremis any Catholic could perform a valid baptism. The requirements were minimal: water, the Trinitarian formula, and sincere intent. The Church had established this principle centuries earlier, precisely for situations like this one: a dying infant, no priest available, a soul in jeopardy. Anna went to the kitchen. She wet her fingers. She touched the baby's forehead and murmured the words she had been taught. It took perhaps 10 seconds. She may not have fully understood what she was doing. She certainly did not understand what she had set in motion. Edgardo recovered. Anna told no one in the household. The act disappeared into the ordinary noise of domestic life, as unremarkable to the family as any other moment in a servant's day. It is one of the persistent patterns of history that consequences bear no necessary relation to the visibility of their causes. A teenage girl's frightened whisper over a basin of water would, within 6 years, reach the desk of Napoleon III. How the secret reached the Inquisition remains somewhat unclear, and the uncertainty matters less than the fact that the institution, once informed, behaved exactly as its own rules required. Anna Maurici left the Mortara household in 1857. At some point thereafter, whether through confession, gossip, the testimony of the neighbor she had consulted, or the inquiry of a parish priest compiling sacramental records, the fact of the baptism came to the attention of the Dominican friars, who administered the Holy Office in Bologna. The Inquisition, by the 1850s, was not the fearsome engine of the Counter-Reformation. It was a bureaucratic remnant, understaffed, and largely concerned with matters of doctrine and sacramental record. But it retained one power that mattered enormously: jurisdiction over baptized souls. Canon law was unambiguous. A valid baptism, performed by anyone, under any circumstances, with or without the knowledge or consent of the parents, created an irrevocable bond between the baptized person and the Catholic Church. A baptized child could not, under any interpretation of church law then in force, be raised in a non-Christian household. The logic was circular and airtight. The sacrament made the child Catholic. The child's Catholic status required Catholic upbringing. Catholic upbringing required removal from a Jewish home. There was no mechanism for reversal, no appeal that could undo what water and words had done. The Church did not claim to have chosen this situation. It claimed to be bound by it, bound by its own sacramental theology, which held that baptism altered the soul permanently, regardless of circumstance or intent. Institutions that have spent centuries building elaborate systems of compulsion often describe themselves, at the crucial moment, as having no choice at all. The Inquisitor of Bologna, Father Pier Gaetano Felletti, reviewed the evidence, confirmed the baptism's validity through Anna Maurici's testimony, and issued the order. On the evening of June 23, 1858, a detachment of papal carabinieri arrived at the Mortara home on the Via Lame. They carried the order. They had come for the boy. What followed was a scene of prolonged domestic horror, and it unfolded not with the melodrama of a raid, but with the bureaucratic patience that is the particular specialty of institutions that believe their authority is beyond appeal. The officers did not break down the door. They knocked. They presented their credentials. They explained, with the practiced calm of men carrying out routine procedure, that the child Edgardo Mortara had been identified as a baptized Catholic and was to be transferred to Rome for proper religious education. Momolo Mortara argued. He demanded to see the documentation. He challenged the basis of the claim. Mariana Mortara pleaded with the officers, with their commander, with God. Neighbors gathered on the Via Lame, drawn by the commotion. The Jewish community's leaders were summoned. The family begged for delay, for an appeal, for anything that might keep their son in the house one more night, one more hour. The officers were not cruel, they were procedural. They had orders. They waited through the evening, through the tears, through what must have been hours of desperate negotiation that was not negotiation at all, because the decision had been made in an office they would never enter, on grounds they were not permitted to contest. The patience of the state is more terrifying than its violence, because patience implies that the outcome was never in doubt. Edgardo was 6 years old. He understood that strangers had come for him and that his mother was weeping. He was carried from the house sometime after midnight, placed in a carriage with a papal officer, and driven south toward Rome. Behind him, Mariana collapsed. Momolo, by the accounts that survive, stood in the doorway of his own home and watched the carriage disappear into a darkness that would, in a sense, never lift. The boy was delivered to the House of Catechumens, an institution in Rome established in the 16th century specifically for the conversion and instruction of Jews and other non-Christians who had, by whatever means, come under Catholic sacramental jurisdiction. It occupied a building near the Church of the Madonna dei Monti, and its operations were funded, with grim irony, in part by a tax levied on the Jewish community of Rome itself. The house was not a prison, exactly. It was something more insidious, a school for forgetting. Children brought there were given new clothes, new routines, new frames of reference for understanding their own lives. They were treated with care, even affection, by priests and nuns who believed sincerely that they were saving souls, that the temporary suffering of separation was nothing compared to the eternal consequences of leaving a baptized child outside the faith. Edgardo was bathed, dressed in new garments, and enrolled in religious instruction. He was 6, and 6-year-olds adapt, not because they consent, but because adaptation is the only tool available to a child who has been removed from everything familiar. Within weeks, the priests reported that the boy was responding well. He was learning his catechism. He was praying. He showed, they said, signs of genuine devotion. The cruelty of the institution was structural rather than personal, which, as a general rule, makes it far more durable. A system that tortures its captives can be condemned by anyone. A system that educates them, clothes them, and genuinely loves them on its own terms is much harder to argue with, because it has given itself the ability to present the captive's compliance as gratitude. Momolo Mortara did not accept what had happened. Within days, he began a campaign to recover his son that would consume the better part of his remaining life, and eventually involve heads of state, international organizations, and editorial boards across 2 continents. He petitioned the Inquisition in Bologna. Father Folletti received him and explained, with what appears to have been genuine regret, that the matter was out of his hands. The boy was now in Rome, under papal jurisdiction. Momolo petitioned the Vatican. He was told that the matter was settled by sacramental law and could not be revisited. He petitioned Cardinal Antonelli, the papal Secretary of State, who was widely regarded as the most politically astute man in Rome. Antonelli understood the damage the case was doing. He also understood that the Pope would not be moved. Momolo traveled to Rome hoping to see his son. He was permitted a visit, supervised, brief, and carefully managed to demonstrate that the boy was well cared for, well fed, and progressing happily in his Catholic education. The visit was designed not as a concession, but as an argument. Look, the child is thriving. Your grief, however real, is misplaced. Momolo returned to Bologna more desperate than before. A parent can fight cruelty. It is much harder to fight an institution that insists it is being kind. The Jewish community of Bologna rallied to the family immediately, and word spread with remarkable speed through the networks that connected Jewish communities across Europe and beyond. By the autumn of 1858, the Mortara case had become an international cause, the most prominent case of its kind in living memory, though not, it should be noted, the only one. The practice of seizing secretly baptized Jewish children had a long history in the Papal States, stretching back centuries. Most cases were local, quiet, and uncontested, the families too powerless or too frightened to resist. What made the Mortara case different was timing. It arrived at precisely the moment when Jewish communities had developed the organizational capacity, the political connections, and the confidence to fight, and at precisely the moment when the Papal States could least afford a scandal that confirmed every charge its enemies had been making for a decade. The Board of Deputies of British Jews raised the matter with the Foreign Office in London. The Alliance Israélite Universelle, newly formed in Paris and searching for a founding cause, took up the case with energy and sophistication. Petitions arrived at the Vatican from Jewish leaders in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, New York, Philadelphia, and Sydney. In the United States, where the case was covered extensively in newspapers from coast to coast, Jewish organizations appealed to President James Buchanan, who made cautious diplomatic inquiries through his envoy in Rome and received nothing in return. Moses Montefiore, Sir Moses, by this time knighted by Queen Victoria, the most prominent Jewish philanthropist in Europe and a man accustomed to negotiating with sovereigns, traveled personally to Rome in the spring of 1859 to plead the family's case with Cardinal Antonelli. The meeting was polite, formal, and entirely fruitless. Antonelli expressed sympathy. He offered nothing. Montefiore departed Rome empty-handed and publicly humiliated, which was itself a diplomatic event. If a man of Montefiore's stature could not secure even a gesture, the papacy was announcing that no external pressure would be acknowledged at all. Behind the Vatican's walls, Pius IX had taken a personal interest in Edgardo that went well beyond institutional custody. The Pope had met the boy, played with him in the Vatican gardens, and reportedly lifted the child onto his knee during audiences. He began referring to Edgardo as his spiritual son. He paid for the boy's education from his personal funds. He visited the house of catechumens to check on the child's progress. Advisors who urged caution, who pointed out the diplomatic cost, the propaganda gift to nationalists, the damage to Catholic prestige in Protestant countries, found the Pope immovable. In his mind, the controversy was not evidence that the Church had done something wrong. It was evidence that the secular world could not comprehend the supreme importance of a baptized soul. To yield the boy would be to admit that human law stood above divine law, that the clamor of newspapers and diplomats outweighed the authority of an irrevocable sacrament. Pius would not do it. He would not do it for Montefiore, or for the British, or for Napoleon III, or for his own Secretary of State. He said reportedly that he had the boy and he would keep him. He said he would have taken the same action, even if it cost him every cardinal in the Church. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that is available only to men who believe they are acting on instructions from God. It does not bend under pressure. Pressure confirms it. Every demand for the child's return became, in the Pope's mind, further proof that the world was arrayed against the faith, and that holding firm was not merely a policy, but a spiritual obligation. This is the psychology of siege, and Pius IX had been living inside it since 1848. The case did not remain a matter of private grief or communal advocacy for long. It entered the mainstream European press and became, almost overnight, a parable about everything that was wrong with theocratic government, not in theory but in practice, not in the abstract language of liberal philosophy, but in the concrete image of a weeping mother and an empty bedroom. French newspapers covered it extensively, and this mattered more than any other coverage, because France was the Papal State's sole military protector. Napoleon III, who maintained French troops in Rome to secure the Pope's temporal kingdom, found himself in an impossible position. Catholic opinion in France broadly supported the Pope, but liberal and Republican opinion was outraged. The Emperor had built his domestic coalition on balancing precisely these forces. The Mortara affair threatened to collapse the balance entirely. Napoleon dispatched diplomatic notes. His ambassador in Rome made discreet but pointed inquiries. The message, conveyed with the coded politeness that European diplomacy preferred to plain speech, was clear. Return the child, and the problem disappears. Pius refused. The diplomatic notes grew less discreet. Pius continued to refuse. The French press grew louder. And in Turin, watching all of this with the focused attention of a chess player who has just seen his opponent blunder a critical piece, sat Cavour. Camillo di Cavour, Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, had spent a decade constructing the conditions for Italian unification. He had modernized Piedmont's economy, cultivated a French alliance cemented by Piedmontese participation in the Crimean War, maneuvered Austria into diplomatic isolation, and built a network of nationalist sympathizers in every Italian state. What he had never fully possessed was the moral argument, the simple, emotional, universally comprehensible case that papal temporal rule was not merely inefficient or archaic, but actively, demonstrably unjust. The Mortara affair handed it to him like a gift. Cavour did not need to exaggerate or distort. He needed only to describe what had actually happened. A government had taken a child from his parents because of what a servant did with a handful of water when the child was a baby. No reasonable person hearing this could defend the system that produced it. The scandal was not that Pius IX had made a mistake. The scandal was that the system was working exactly as designed. Cavour's newspapers in Turin published the story relentlessly. His diplomats raised it in every European capital. The case became a wedge, driven not between Catholics and Jews, not between faith and secularism in the abstract, but between the papacy and every government, Catholic or otherwise, that had been tolerating papal temporal authority as a harmless anachronism. After the Mortara affair, it was no longer harmless. It was visible, and what is visible can be opposed. The diplomatic fallout accelerated what military planning had already set in motion. In the spring of 1859, Piedmont, with French support secured through a secret agreement at Plombières, went to war against Austria and won decisive victories at Magenta and Solferino. The peace settlement redrew the map of northern Italy in Piedmont's favor. Within months, popular uprisings and stage-managed plebiscites across central Italy voted for annexation to Piedmont. The Papal States lost the Romagna, the Marches, and Umbria, the very territories that included Bologna, the city from which Edgardo Mortara had been taken barely a year earlier. Pius IX excommunicated everyone involved: Cavour, Victor Emmanuel, the voters, the administrators. It had the political force of a man shaking his fist at a tide that had already come in. By 1860, Garibaldi's astonishing campaign in the south had delivered Sicily and Naples to the nationalist cause. The Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed in March 1861, with Turin as its capital and Victor Emmanuel II as its king. The Papal States had been reduced to Rome and a thin belt of surrounding territory, the so-called Patrimony of St. Peter, defended only by a French garrison that Napoleon III was finding increasingly difficult to justify to his own parliament and press. The emperor was caught between Catholic voters who expected him to protect the Pope and a liberal establishment that regarded papal rule as an embarrassment to French modernity. The Mortara case had not created this dilemma, but it had sharpened it into something that could no longer be managed quietly. The connection between the Mortara affair and these events was not mechanical. No general cited the kidnapping of a Jewish boy as a reason to march. No treaty referenced it. But the case had done something that no diplomatic note or battlefield victory could accomplish on its own. It had made the moral case against papal temporal power visceral and personal and permanent. It had given the abstraction a face, a 6-year-old face, and it had demonstrated, in terms that required no political sophistication to understand, what it meant when a government placed sacramental theology above parental love, above natural right, above the consensus of the civilized world. Every editorial, every parliamentary debate, every diplomatic exchange about the future of the Papal States now carried, somewhere in its background radiation, the image of a boy taken from his mother at midnight. In Rome, behind the Vatican's shrinking borders, Edgardo Mortara grew. He received an excellent education. The Church, whatever its other failings in this matter, did not neglect the mind it had claimed. He studied at the House of Catechumens, then at a seminary. He learned Latin, French, German, Spanish, and several other languages. He was bright, apparently devout, and by all available accounts adapted to his circumstances with a completeness that his parents found more devastating than open cruelty would have been. A child who is visibly miserable can be pointed to as evidence of injustice. A child who has been successfully converted is, in the eyes of the institution that took him, proof that the taking was justified. This is the trap that total institutions build for their captives. Cooperation becomes evidence of consent, and evidence of consent becomes retroactive permission. Momolo Mortara continued to fight. He petitioned every authority that would receive him. He traveled across Italy. He enlisted allies in every capital. But the legal and institutional walls were absolute. Under papal law, Edgardo was Catholic, and Catholics could not be surrendered to non-Catholic households. The only scenario in which the boy might have been returned would have required the Pope to declare the baptism invalid, and this Pius would never do, because it would call into question the sacramental foundation on which the entire claim rested. To admit that a baptism performed by a frightened servant girl in a kitchen with water from a basin could be invalidated by secular pressure would be to concede that sacraments were subject to negotiation. The Church had spent 15 centuries establishing the opposite principle. It would not reverse course for one family's grief, however public, however justified. The Mortaras were permitted occasional visits, always supervised, always brief. Over time, the visits grew further apart. The boy they had known was receding, replaced by a young man who spoke the language of the Church with fluency and conviction. Edgardo expressed devotion to Pius IX. He spoke of his vocation. He was, by his teenage years, lost to his family in every sense except the biological, and that sense alone was not enough to bring him home. On September 20th, 1870, Italian troops breached the Aurelian walls of Rome at the Porta Pia. The French garrison had been withdrawn weeks earlier. Napoleon III, defeated and captured at Sedan in the Franco-Prussian War, deposed by his own people, was in no position to defend anyone, least of all a pope whose cause had become a liability. The papal army, such as it was, offered token resistance. By afternoon, the city had fallen. The Papal States, after more than 1,000 years of continuous existence, ceased to exist. A plebiscite followed. The Romans voted overwhelmingly for annexation to Italy. Pius IX declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, retreated behind its walls, and refused to recognize the Italian state, its laws, or its legitimacy. He would maintain this posture, the so-called Roman question, until his death in 1878. He had started his reign as a reformer and ended it as the last absolute theocratic monarch in Western Europe, barricaded inside a palace, issuing condemnations of a world that had moved decisively and irreversibly beyond his reach. The fall of Rome did not free Edgardo Mortara. He was 19 years old, and the conversion was complete. He had entered the Augustinian order and been ordained as a priest. He took the religious name Pius, in honor of the Pope who had claimed him as a spiritual son. The Italian government, after unification, did offer him the legal freedom to leave religious life if he wished. He did not wish it. Whether this represented genuine belief, the deep conditioning of an institution that had shaped him since the age of 6, or some fusion of the two that defies simple categorization from the outside, is a question that has no clean answer. What can be said is that the family was destroyed and the boy was gone, and the institution that performed the destruction experienced his devotion as vindication. The Church pointed to Father Pio Mortara as evidence that the grace of baptism had worked precisely as theology predicted. A soul claimed for Christ, raised in truth, now serving God willingly. The family saw something else entirely. Edgardo Mortara lived a long and remarkably itinerant life. He preached across Europe, in Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, Spain, in 9 languages by some accounts. He traveled to the United States. He became a figure of minor celebrity in Catholic circles, occasionally invoked as a living testament to the power of the sacraments. He reportedly attempted, late in life, to convert his own mother on her deathbed, a detail that, if true, contains more grief than any amount of commentary can usefully add to it. He died on March 11, 1940, in a Belgian monastery at the age of 88. The Second World War had begun 6 months earlier. Within 2 years, the country in which he died would be deporting Jews to the death camps. The world had not, it turned out, resolved the questions that his case had raised about the relationship between religious authority and human rights, between institutional power and parental love, between a claim made on a child's soul and the child's right to belong to the family that made him. His parents never recovered. Momolo Mortara spent the decades after the seizure in a condition of sustained anguish that contemporaries described as having aged him beyond recognition. Mariana lived until 1890, long enough to see the Papal States fall, long enough to see Rome become the capital of a secular Italy, long enough to know that her son was a Catholic priest who honored the Pope who had taken him. She lived long enough to understand that the political victory, the end of theocratic rule, the triumph of secular law, the vindication of everything the liberal world had argued for, had not given her back her boy. Political justice and personal justice are not the same thing, and the distance between them is where most of the sorrow in history lives. Pius IX was beatified by the Catholic Church in the year 2000, a preliminary step toward sainthood. The decision was controversial, and the Mortara case was among the principal reasons cited by those who objected. Jewish organizations protested. Historians pointed to the case as evidence of a pontificate defined by inflexibility and overreach. The Church, for its part, has never formally apologized for the seizure, nor repudiated the canonical logic that made it possible. The sacramental theology remains intact. A valid baptism, in Catholic teaching, is still irrevocable, still permanent, still understood to alter the soul in ways that no human authority can reverse. The difference is only that the Church no longer governs a state with police at its disposal, no longer commands the carabinieri, no longer maintains a house of catechumens with beds prepared for children who did not choose to be there. Institutions, like individuals, rarely abandon their deepest convictions. They simply lose the power to enforce them. What remains, after power is gone, is the claim, still held, still taught, still believed by millions, that the truth it possessed was worth more than the freedom it destroyed. Whether this is faith or tragedy depends, as it always has, on whether you are the one holding the truth or the one losing the child.